the power of silence in a relationship. Did you ever stop to think that silence can speak louder than words? Sometimes silence isn't a sign of withdrawal or disinterest. It's a way of communicating something deeper. We often think of silence as empty space, a void between words, but in reality, it can be a language all its own. When she's silent, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything is fine or that she doesn't have anything to say. More often than not, it's her way of expressing something that words simply can't capture. Maybe she's feeling overwhelmed, unheard, or misunderstood. It's a form of communication that, if not understood, can easily be misinterpreted. Think about it for a moment. When someone is in emotional distress, they might struggle to find the right words to express their feelings. Emotions can be complex and difficult to articulate, and when words fall short, silence steps in. It's a way of retreating, not because she doesn't care, but because she's struggling to process what's going on inside. It's in these moments that silence becomes a cry for help, a way of asking, "Do you see me? Do you understand what I'm going through?" But if you fail to recognize that silence for what it is, it can easily slip into the background, unnoticed and unaddressed. Our latest videos, your support truly means the world to us. If you find this video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. It really helps us share this message with more people. I'd love to know your thoughts on today's topic. If you're enjoying the content, drop a 1 in the comments. If it didn't quite click with you, just comment a 0. Your feedback is incredibly important. It helps me create content that better matches what you're looking for. From vulnerability, because in the past, when she opened up, she didn't feel heard, or worse, she felt dismissed. It's easy to forget how important it is to create an environment where someone feels safe to express themselves freely, especially in intimate relationships. When she remained silent, it might have been because she didn't know how to start the conversation without risking the same disappointment, the same frustration, the same hurt that she had experienced before. The longer you let her silence linger without acknowledging it, the more she retreated into herself. Each time you failed to check in with her, to show concern, to gently ask her what was on her mind, she internalized the idea that maybe it didn't matter. Perhaps she began to feel invisible, like her emotions were something to be swept under the rug. Silence became her only way of coping with the emotional disconnect. And every time you didn't address it, it solidified the belief that her feelings weren't important enough to talk about, that her silence was all she could offer. And let's be honest, relationships are built on communication. Communication isn't just about talking, it's about listening, understanding, and meeting the other person halfway. When you fail to notice the silence, it becomes an emotional void that no words can fill. The disconnect starts to grow, not because you're fighting, but because you're not engaging. You're not addressing the core of the issue that she was trying to communicate through her silence. It's a quiet cry for help, not in the form of words, but in the form of absence. Over time, that absence can turn into resentment, frustration, and loneliness. And that's the danger. When her silence isn't acknowledged, it begins to feel like a wall between you. It's not just that you're missing out on her words, you're missing out on her essence, her emotional state, her need for reassurance. The longer you ignore it, the more it starts to feel like a choice, a decision that you made by default to let her feelings go unheard. But here's where it gets tricky. Silence often comes with an underlying fear. She might have been scared to speak up because she was afraid that her emotions would be dismissed, misunderstood, or worse, that she would be criticized for feeling the way she did. The silence, therefore, wasn't just about withholding words. It was about fear of vulnerability, and when vulnerability isn't met with understanding, it can lead to an even deeper silence, one that becomes harder to break the longer it persists. You see, silence in a relationship isn't always a choice made consciously. Sometimes it's an unconscious response to emotional exhaustion. She might have been carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words, and instead of burdening you with her thoughts, she chose silence, hoping you would pick up on the cues, hoping you would notice the tension in her body, the shift in her eyes, the distance in her touch. But when you didn't understand her silence, it meant that she was left with that emotional weight alone, creating even more distance between the two of you. It's a painful realization, but understanding her silence could have been the key to unlocking the emotional intimacy that was missing. it's not just about talking more, it's about talking better. Understanding the language of unspoken feelings, the subtle nuances of body language, and the emotional cues that often go unnoticed. Silence, when recognized and responded to with compassion, can be the gateway to deeper connection and healing. It's not something to be feared or ignored, it's something to be met with patience and understanding. In the end, her silence wasn't meant to push you away, it was an invitation for you to get closer, to understand her in ways that words couldn't express. The question is, did you answer that invitation? Or did you let her silence speak louder than her voice ever could? When you failed to understand her silence, it wasn't just about missing the signs or overlooking her subtle cues. It was about misunderstanding the very essence of her emotional needs. Silence in a relationship is not just an absence of words, it's an emotional expression in its own right. And the longer you allowed it to go unaddressed, the more it became a silent testament to a growing emotional distance. She needed you to read between the lines, to hear her even when she wasn't speaking, to understand the weight of her quiet moments. Silence can be a cry for connection, a deep yearning to be seen and understood. Often, when someone withdraws into silence, it's not because they don't care, it's because they are overwhelmed by emotions they don't know how to express. In that moment, she wasn't trying to punish you or manipulate you. She was hoping you would step up and meet her where she was. Silence often becomes the last resort when words fail, when vulnerability has been met with dismissal or apathy in the past, and when you ignored it, you ignored the cry for help that she was trying to communicate without ever uttering a single word. It's so easy to misinterpret silence as indifference or a sign that everything is fine, but for her, that silence could have been a reflection of her emotional exhaustion. Exhaustion from trying to communicate her feelings over and over again, only to feel unheard, misunderstood, or worse, dismissed. Her silence wasn't about shutting you out. It was about giving you a chance to finally understand her, to show that you were willing to meet her halfway. When you failed to do that, she likely felt abandoned, not because you physically left, but because emotionally you weren't there. The truth is, when silence goes unaddressed, it silently erodes the foundation of a relationship. You may think that by not acknowledging it, things will simply pass over, that it's just a phase, or that she'll open up when she's ready. But silence, when left unresolved, builds walls. It creates distance not just between two people, but between two hearts that should have been connecting on a much deeper level. Each time her silence was ignored, it reinforced the belief that her feelings weren't worth discussing, that her voice wasn't important enough to hear. But you see, silence is a language, a cry for attention that is often more powerful than words. And in this silence, she was seeking validation, reassurance, and emotional intimacy. She was hoping that you would recognize that her quiet moments were a reflection of something deeper. But when you didn't address the silence, you unknowingly reinforced her fear that her emotions were too much to bear, too complicated to explain, and ultimately not worth addressing. The longer this silence stretched, the more it became clear she had no other way to express herself. She wasn't pulling away to hurt you. She was pulling away because she was trying to protect herself. She might have feared that speaking her truth would only drive you further away, that her emotional vulnerability would be met with more distance, more misunderstanding, or even dismissal. So, she retreated. She built her own emotional barrier because in her mind it was safer than continuing to be vulnerable in a relationship that didn't seem to offer the understanding she craved. And here's the painful part. The more you let that silence linger, the more it grew. It was no longer just her withdrawing, it was the relationship itself, slowly fading into the background. The connection you once had began to wither because it wasn't nurtured by the necessary conversations, the emotional openness, the mutual understanding that was so desperately needed. Each moment of silence was a missed opportunity to heal, to connect, to understand her better. Silence, when misunderstood, can create a void that no amount of words can fill. When you fail to recognize the emotional weight behind that silence, you miss the opportunity to bridge the gap. You miss the chance to step into her world, to see things from her perspective, to show her that her feelings matter. Instead, the silence continues to grow until it becomes a permanent part of your relationship dynamic. This silence wasn't a signal that she didn't care. It was the opposite. It was a signal that she cared too much to be vulnerable with someone who might not understand. It was a plea, for you to step in and meet her emotional needs. To finally understand that sometimes silence is the loudest message of all. The real question is, did you hear it before it was too late? When she left, it wasn't just about the silence or the moments you missed. It was about the underlying emotional neglect that had quietly built up over time. She needed you to see her beyond the surface, to understand that when she was silent, it wasn't about not caring or withdrawing intentionally. It was about feeling disconnected, feeling invisible in a space where she desperately needed to be seen and heard. But when you didn't recognize the significance of those moments, when you didn't acknowledge her vulnerability in those silences, she felt unseen, and that's where the emotional gap began to widen. Emotional neglect is often not the result of malice or intent. It's a slow, creeping realization that something essential is missing, something that goes beyond physical presence or words. It's the quiet dismissal of emotional needs, the consistent failure to recognize when someone is reaching out in the only way they know how. She needed you to understand that silence wasn't the absence of emotion, it was a manifestation of it. It was her way of saying, I need you to hear me without me having to scream for your attention. She was waiting for the moment when you would step into her world, embrace her emotions, and recognize that her silence was the loudest form of communication she had left. But in many cases, emotional neglect becomes a slow erosion of the foundation that once held a relationship together. It's not about the big, obvious mistakes. It's the small, consistent neglects that add up over time. It's forgetting to check in on her emotional well-being, dismissing her feelings as insignificant, or assuming that everything was fine because she wasn't explicitly expressing a problem. It's the failure to notice when she becomes withdrawn, or when her energy shifts, or when she stops initiating conversations, simply because she's afraid of being misunderstood or rejected. The more you ignored her silence, the more she felt the sting of emotional abandonment. It wasn't just the absence of communication, it was the absence of emotional connection. When you failed to acknowledge the weight of her quiet moments, you also failed to acknowledge her emotional landscape, the deep-seated fears, anxieties, and needs that were driving her silence. She wasn't pulling away because she didn't care. She was pulling away because she had no other way to protect herself from the growing emotional void. And this emotional neglect took its toll. Over time, she likely started to feel that her needs were secondary, that her emotional well-being was no longer a priority. She might have wondered, if I'm not being heard when I'm silent, will I ever truly be understood? And that question, unanswered, became a painful realization that her voice, her emotional truth, wasn't valued in the way it deserved to be. The more she felt unheard, the more distant she became. The more she felt emotionally neglected, the more her silence became a way to protect her heart from being broken by someone who wasn't paying attention to her deepest emotional needs. But this is the crux of the issue. Emotional neglect isn't about a lack of love. It's about a lack of emotional attunement. It's about failing to tune into your partner's needs, to read between the lines, to notice when they're reaching out in ways that aren't as obvious as verbal communication. It's the inability to understand that emotional intimacy requires more than just being physically present. It requires being emotionally present too. It's about recognizing that her silence is not an absence but a presence of emotion, a deep yearning for connection that hasn't been fully met. When you fail to notice these emotional cues, when you fail to be attuned to her needs, you contribute to the slow, painful process of emotional disconnection. This disconnection might not happen overnight, but over time, it builds walls between two people who should have been growing closer. And once those walls are built, once the emotional distance has widened enough, it becomes increasingly difficult to break them down. The emotional neglect, the silence, the lack of understanding, it all becomes too much to bear. And in the end, she may walk away not because she doesn't love you, but because she can no longer stay in a relationship where her emotional needs are ignored. It's a heartbreaking realization, but the truth is, once you fail to understand the significance of silence, once you neglect the emotional truths being communicated in those quiet moments, the relationship is no longer able to thrive. It's not about one mistake or one missed conversation. It's about the cumulative effect of emotional neglect over time. And that, my friends, is what often leads to the moment when someone feels they can no longer stay. They leave because they've realized that silence, once their last plea for connection, has now become a barrier too thick to break.